Hello, Comms 363 students. In this presentation, I'm focusing on your methods section of your final report. First, what not to do before I go into what you should be doing. Please do not structure this section by description, narration, and justification. In the instructions, it uses these terms, but they're argument types that you use. They're not subsections or subheadings. Secondly, do not identify group members or names. Simply speak as we. Try to avoid talking about internal Comms 363 structures and processes, such as how you coordinated your group and the fact that you had a report A or a report B. This would unnecessarily lengthen your methods section and also involve telling your readers things that are not necessary to the main point of the methods section. And finally, try to avoid passive voice, especially in your main verb. We know that sometimes it's hard to avoid using it anywhere, but try to focus most of your main statements in your sentences on subjects and verbs that have active verbs. So here's an example. Data was collected, that's passive, and the survey collected data, that's active voice. You can use we and you can use the researchers to talk about yourself. That would be fine. That's normal in a methods section to use we. The aims of the section are things that you should keep in mind throughout. The primary easiest way to structure your methods would be to narrate in phases. And that's because through collection, selection, and analysis, that's the chronology of a normal research process. You collect information, then you choose particular parts of it to focus on, and then you analyze those particular parts. And within each of those three phases, you could describe your data sources and methods. And we know that it's also common in methods section to categorize by data source. So you might have a survey data section separated from your website data section, and that would be fine as well as an alternative. But through each section, then you would still have to go through chronologically. And it's nice to be able to combine both survey data and website data when you talk about analysis. And justifying your methods is the main argument, other than simply saying what methods you used and how they were structured. The other point is why they were used. And here you speak to your audience and think about their specific website and needs, not just any website needing this type of analysis. And think about how it presents your own ethos, your rigor, which means your conscientiousness, your attention to detail, your awareness of various factors, your ethics, especially when it comes into understanding how the survey was constructed with research ethics in mind. And throughout the section, it shows your understanding of logical procedure without getting into the nitty-gritty of terminology about methods. And it does show some awareness of strengths and weaknesses. You don't have to mention this at the end of every section or paragraph in this methods, but you should show some awarenesses of the fact that we only did one human participant method, not three, and we also had some limitations and also strengths in terms of having multiple data sources, etc. I'm first going to go into the first phase of data collection, and this slide doesn't have on it the survey data because that takes its own slide next. You can think of conceptual research as an earlier phase in your data collection where you were understanding the basic terms and concepts of usability. And here you don't need to get into detail, you just need to describe the phase or the task, how you began by understanding what these terms were, and you list and define them later when you talk about which ones you selected. In terms of website research, you collected information on its context, and how did you collect that? Well, you went online and you looked around. You found out about the organization because, of course, you're new to it, and so you don't give the findings here at all. You just say, here's what we looked for and why, okay? And the fact that you did a content inventory as you did report A The fact that you look through the website itself, you know enough about the website by clicking through it, reading some pages, looking at visuals, thinking about what you're seeing there. Now the survey, that takes more information and more complexity. The context, content, and response are generally the order in which you talk about the survey. And sometimes people start in the middle of things. So don't start in the middle. Say, a general overview about, well, who designed it, when did it happen, who was recruited, where, all those simple things, put them first. And then you could also think about, well, ethics of recruitment and how we treated data with security. And here's a caution, don't get anonymity mixed up with confidentiality. Anonymity has to do with not showing the name or ID number or email address of the participant to anyone else. Confidentiality has to do with secrecy of the data. And when you say, please keep this information confidential, it's not about hiding the identity of the person, it's about hiding or keeping secret the information itself. And we did not want to do that, so we put in the consent form for participants, we said it explicitly, we are not going to keep your data confidential because we want to be able to quote you. So after the context comes content, and here's where you just generally introduce your reader who has no idea about what this survey asked or what it looked like, what kind of themes did it cover, and what question structures were there. The fact that it had a bunch of demographic questions, that it had questions that oriented the reader to a certain, like finding tasks or looking around the website, and they got more global and general, and at the end it was overall assessment text questions. And here's where you give an example, usually of one of the more complex questions in the middle of the survey that has answer items and rating scales. And in your example, you could even refer to a screenshot from the PDF version of the website survey to even show how, people were presented with this type of question structure. But in your paragraph, you need to at least verbally summarize the nature of such a complex question. Survey response, that's the final outcome of the method. And here you're going to provide an overview numerically and qualitatively of who responded and how many people they were. And you're going to refer to your table 1, which is the end of your methods section, has a table that has respondents listed by age, by sex, and by another factor that you choose. So this information gets just mentioned here, and you might want to conclude any talk about the survey itself with something about its strengths and weaknesses before you move on to another topic. The second phase is data selection. Once you've gathered a whole pile of data, you can't necessarily analyze all of it, or maybe you prioritize certain features and concepts. So you're going to select concepts and select data. Here's where you itemize the actual concept terms within the general categories of usability and rhetoric. You name what you selected, and these should be just the terms that come up in your findings, and they should echo a general list that you have provided already in your introduction, when your introduction gave the reader a sense of what the scope was for this report and what it covered. So here's where you get into more like giving the conceptual terms and then defining them briefly. And here you can cite the sources if helpful, and being very general about what the concepts mean, and a little rationale for why they're good choices for the website. Either you could include the rationale concept by concept, or you can generalize after a list and say why these concepts were chosen for this particular website. Selecting data to analyze in detail includes certain survey questions and certain pages of the features of the website. And remember here, you're not going to talk about how you divvied up your tasks according to different group members and report A and report B. That's all internal to 363, and it's not relevant to the reader. So simply just say we chose particular survey questions because they related to these topics, and you don't have to get into the detail, and just say, we selected according to these criteria. and we selected pages and features according to those criteria. And you don't have to list everything that you've selected as data. Just talk about the process of selection or the criteria of selection when it comes to your data set of the website and the survey. Thirdly, you have analysis, and I find that this is the weakest part of most people's methods section, other than forgetting to include certain things about the survey because it's pretty complex. I find that the analysis section is difficult for students because it tends to be internal to our intellectual processes. And especially if students are coming from engineering or geoscience, they might have a sense that collecting data means you go out into the world or you go into a lab and you physically interact with objects and you measure their properties or their, how they behave. And here, when we're dealing with research on human beings and on communication processes, the way you analyze your data is internal to your brain, and the object of analysis tends to be text or things that you observe about communication. So focus on intellectual processes, and here on this slide you'll see generally qualitative and quantitative have been separated out, but each bullet begins with a verb: interpreting, counting, considering, accounting for. And so these are processes that happen in your mind as you are interacting with data. And keep in mind, as I show in the red corner here of the red text, that these are not a communication process. So a data analysis process doesn't mean here's how I constructed a table, here's how I constructed a figure, here's how I wrote a paragraph. We're talking here about research-based data analysis prior to the Communication Act. Okay, so quantitative and qualitative are not necessarily ways in which you need to categorize them for your audience. You could, if you wanted to, mention these are the qualitative and quantitative processes that we use. You could do that, but it's not necessary to give them that categorization. You could simply talk about it procedurally and chronologically, or you can break these out according to method type if you felt that organizing it by data source would be better. Then you could talk about how you analyze survey data. First we did this, we also did that, then we did this, that kind of thing, after you talk about what data you collected and selected. The other aspects of analysis that you should think about are how you kept your focus, in order to statements. And so occasionally you justify things to say, well, we did this because our focus was on that. And throughout your data analysis, the main point is to evaluate the website's current strengths and weaknesses. So don't lose track of that as the main goal. And a good method of analysis is one that can actually achieve that goal or contribute to it. A thematic subfocus is an aspect of analysis where you are able to break down your analysis question by question, and that's really the concept terms we mentioned on a previous slide. So because of that, you're able to group together survey data on each theme. You're able to, on each theme, analyze data from the surveys and the website itself. And so you see, when you talk about analysis, you could talk about it outside or beyond or after you talk about both your survey data and your website data, because analysis involves synthesizing information from both of them. Contextual interpretation, that's another task that you did. You considered not just the micro level of analysis of what a particular survey question yielded or what a particular page said, but you thought about the data in light of the context of the website, in light of the fact that the methods of the survey were of a certain type that pushed the responses in particular ways and not others. So here we have limitations and confirmations. And confirmations really means that, if your website survey says something, well, does the website itself confirm that data? What the findings could mean for the perspective of website owners is something that you think about when you write after the list of your conclusions. In your conclusions section, there's usually a paragraph where you bring insight. And so this only requires really a sentence or two to talk about contextual interpretation, to just remind your reader that, as we did this analysis, we didn't get so tied up in the nitty-gritty, but we thought about, well, how are we going to make meaning out of this data, and how are we going to evaluate according to according to criteria that makes sense for the website and the organization. The final point there about time could be things like, we considered what the website currently offers, but also, the future development in the recommendations, that kind of thing. But the primary aspect of your analysis is going to be evaluation, not recommendation. Finally, survey participant demographics is part of your methods section. This is the table I mentioned earlier, where you're supposed to incorporate within one table, not 3 separate tables, information about age, sex, and one other feature of the participants that come from the earlier questions of the survey. And it's not a graph, so it's not a pie chart, not a bar chart, it's a table. And you can choose which criterion is going to be your major stub head or for the left-hand column of a table. Are you going to prioritize for the headings or across the top or along the side? Are you going to prioritize age or sex, or are those going to be secondary variables? Okay, so choose one as your primary variable to be of the most interest or something, or else you can just simply combine the data and collect it together in a single table, separating out the 3 sections and unifying it with a unified title and unified headings. So this gets placed at the methods section ending, and if it qualifies for size, look in the Smith Handbook under table and figure formatting and find out if it's too big and needs to go in the appendix instead. And the rationale for placing it either at the end of the methods, ideally, or if it's too big in the appendix, is that it wouldn't interrupt the flow of the narrative. Wherever you talked about the survey methods and the respondents, it might have been some paragraphs earlier, or it might have been right before the table, but in any case, it wouldn't interrupt your argument or the flow of your narration. And it also comes right before the findings. And that way it wouldn't get in the way of presenting findings from the survey. People would already know that, once we're looking at findings from the survey, the data that's from these people of this type. So that's my overview, and I'm going to be looking at a sample in a separate video since the time of this video has probably run out. So I'm going to talk to you later with a sample.